Nobody in the ancient world checked into an inn and expected comfort. That image you carry, the weary traveler arriving at a warm establishment, asking for a room, being turned away because there was no vacancy, that image is almost entirely wrong. The inn of first-century Judea was not a place of hospitality. It was a place of transaction, risk, and survival. And what happened to you if your money ran out inside one of those places was something that most modern readers of the Gospels have never stopped to consider. What was an inn, exactly, in the world Jesus walked through? Who ran it? Who stayed there? What did it smell like, sound like, feel like at midnight when the lamps burned low? And more importantly, what happened to the man, the woman, the family who arrived with coins in their belt and woke up one morning with nothing left? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels and how we understand the radical nature of what Jesus said and did in that world. The first thing to know is that the ancient inn, called a pandokion in Greek, a word that literally means the place that receives everything and everyone, was not a business built on dignity. It was built on necessity. It sat along the major trade and pilgrimage roads of the Roman Empire, at intervals of roughly 1 day's walking distance, because a traveler who could not reach shelter before nightfall was a traveler who might not survive. Bandits, cold, wild animals, exposure. The roads of Judea and the surrounding regions were genuinely dangerous after sunset. The inn was not a luxury. It was the last wall between a person and disaster. If you are finding this content valuable, consider subscribing to this channel. There is much more of this world waiting to be uncovered, one detail at a time. Physically, the typical pandokion was built around a central courtyard open to the sky. Animals, donkeys, camels, oxen, were tied along the outer walls of the ground floor, their feed troughs carved directly into the stone. The smell was immediate and permanent. Dung, hay, animal sweat, leather, and the particular sourness of human bodies that had walked 40 or 50 kilometers without water enough to wash. The upper level, if there was one, held a long common room, not individual chambers. Travelers unrolled their own mats on the floor. Privacy was not a concept that had been purchased. You slept next to merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, laborers, and people whose stories you would never know. The innkeeper, almost universally a man of low social status in Jewish society, suspected of theft, overcharging, and moral looseness, managed this chaos with a simple principle: you pay, you stay. The arrangement was daily. You paid for the night. You paid for your animal's fodder. You paid for any food you consumed. There was no line of credit. There was no goodwill extended to strangers, because strangers in that world were a category of person that carried no social weight. You had no family network here, no rabbi who vouched for you, no village elder whose name could open a door. You were alone with whatever you carried, and the moment that ran out, everything changed. When your money ran out at an inn in the time of Jesus, the first thing that happened was not a conversation. It was a silence. The innkeeper did not sit you down and negotiate. He did not ask about your circumstances or your destination or the reason your purse had gone empty. In the economy of the ancient road, explanation was not currency. What happened was simpler and more brutal than any modern eviction. Your mat was taken from the common room. Your animal, if you had one, was no longer fed. The access to water, even the basic clay jar that sat in the corner of the courtyard, became something you were no longer entitled to. You were not thrown into the street immediately. Not always. The process was more like a slow withdrawal of the conditions that made survival possible. First the food, then the sleeping space, then the water. The innkeeper understood that a man without resources was still a man with a body, and a body in distress on your property was bad for business. So the removal was systematic and quiet. You were made to feel, through accumulation of small denials, that you no longer existed inside those walls. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the logic of a world without social safety structures. The inn existed in a gap between two forms of protection that every person in that world depended on: family and village. If you were home, your family fed you when you were sick, sheltered you when you were broke, absorbed your disasters into the collective. If you were in your village, your neighbors, your synagogue, your community of obligation, they caught you before you fell completely. But the road was the space between those nets, and the inn sat precisely in that space. To run out of money at an inn was to discover exactly how thin the membrane was between dignity and destitution in the ancient world. Consider the specific mechanics. A standard day's lodging along a major Judean road in the 1st century cost roughly 1 or 2 bronze pruteaux, the smallest coins in circulation, the coins Jesus pointed to when a widow dropped 2 of them into the temple treasury, and he said she had given more than all the wealthy donors combined. 1 or 2 of those, per day, per animal, the same or more. A modest traveler on a journey of 5 days needed to carry not just the minimum fare, but a buffer for delays caused by weather, illness, road conditions, or the simple unpredictability of ancient travel. Most travelers carried that buffer. Many did not. The traveler who arrived at an inn with exactly enough for the journey ahead was already in danger. 1 lame donkey, 1 day of fever, 1 washed-out bridge forcing a longer route. Any single disruption could consume that margin entirely. And the roads of 1st century Judea were full of disruptions. Roman tax collectors operated checkpoints. Bandits, not the romanticized kind, but desperate, hungry men, worked the mountain passes between Jerusalem and Jericho with brutal regularity. Illness traveled with the caravans. Accidents happened daily on roads that were unpaved, unlit, and unpoliced beyond the major garrison towns. The man in Jesus' parable who was beaten, robbed, and left half dead on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was not a dramatic exception. He was a recognizable type. His audience had seen that man. Some of them had been that man. The road produced him with regularity, and everyone listening to Jesus that day understood instinctively what it meant to end up stripped of resources in a place where you had no name and no network. The question was never whether it could happen to you. The question was, what happened next? There was a word in the Greek-speaking world of the 1st century that captured exactly this condition. The word was aporos, literally, without a path. It did not mean simply poor. It meant the specific state of a person who had arrived at a point where no road forward was visible, no option, no exit, no next move. The aporos traveler at an inn was not merely broke. He was suspended between the place he had come from and the place he could not reach, in a building that was actively withdrawing the conditions of his survival, in a social world that had no mechanism to receive him. What were his actual options? The first was begging. In the courtyard of the inn itself, or along the road just outside it, a man could position himself and extend his hand. But begging in the ancient world was not a neutral act. It was a declaration of social death. In Jewish society particularly, a man who begged was a man who had exhausted every other form of claim on family, on community, on God's provision through honest labor. To beg was to make your shame visible and permanent. Other travelers passing through would see you. If any of them knew your village, your family, your name, that information would travel. Shame in that world was not a private experience. It was a public fact that attached itself to households and lineages. A father who begged on the road could damage the marriage prospects of his children back home. The ripple was real and it was long. The second option was debt bondage. An innkeeper who was willing, and not all were, might agree to absorb your outstanding balance in exchange for labor. You would work in the courtyard, feed the animals, carry water from the cistern, clean what needed cleaning in a building that smelled the way those buildings smelled. This was not employment. It was a temporary suspension of your freedom inside the walls of a man who now owned your time and your body's output until the debt was cleared. The innkeeper set the terms. He calculated what your labor was worth. The math was rarely in your favor. The third option was the most desperate and the least discussed: abandonment of everything that slowed you down. Travelers in extremis have always faced the calculus of the road. What can I leave behind to move faster and farther on less? A sick animal left tied to a post with no explanation. Goods sold at catastrophic loss to another traveler in the courtyard at dawn. Even clothing reduced to the minimum needed to survive the night temperatures of the Judean hills, which dropped sharply even in spring, cold enough to kill a weakened person who had not eaten. It is into this precise texture of reality that the parable of the Good Samaritan lands with its full weight. Jesus told that story to a legal expert who had asked him a question designed to justify a narrow definition of neighbor. And Jesus answered not with a principle, but with a scene. A man on the road, beaten, robbed, left half dead. A priest who passed. A Levite who passed. And then a Samaritan, a man from a people the Jewish audience considered ritually impure, socially contemptible, theologically wrong, who stopped. But notice what the Samaritan did not do. He did not simply help the man to his feet and wish him well. He bound his wounds, using his own oil and wine, expensive supplies he carried for his own journey. He loaded the injured man onto his own animal, which meant the Samaritan walked. He brought him to an inn. And then, and this is the detail that the first-century audience would have heard with an intake of breath, he paid the innkeeper 2 denarii and said, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." 2 denarii. Roughly 2 days' wages for a common laborer, enough to cover lodging, food, water, and basic care for several days, paid in advance, with a promise of more. The Samaritan had just done the one thing the economic logic of the inn made almost impossible. He had inserted a credit-worthy guarantor between a helpless stranger and the systematic withdrawal of survival conditions. He had given the innkeeper a reason to keep providing care even after the injured man's own resources were zero. He had, in the language of that world, covered the man's name with his own. The innkeeper in that parable is not a villain. That is important to understand. He is a man operating inside the only logic available to him, the logic of a system with no margin for charity, no institutional mechanism for absorbing loss, no social obligation toward the stranger beyond the transaction already completed. When the Samaritan placed 2 denarii in his hand and made a spoken promise of more, the innkeeper did not become a generous man. He became a man with a reason. And in the world Jesus described, a reason was everything. It was the difference between a door that stayed open and a door that closed. This is what made the Samaritan's act so structurally radical. It was not simply emotional kindness. It was the insertion of an entirely different economic and social logic into a space that had been governed by a colder one. The injured man on the floor of that inn had no family network to call upon, no village elder to vouch for him, no name that carried weight in that town. He was, in every practical sense, a poros, without a path. And the Samaritan built him one, not with sentiment, with oil, wine, his own animal, 2 denarii, and his word. Jesus told this story in response to the question, "Who is my neighbor?" But the legal expert who asked that question was trying to draw a boundary, to establish the outer limit of obligation, the point beyond which a righteous man was no longer required to act. And Jesus answered by describing a world in which the man who acted had every cultural and religious reason not to. The Samaritan crossed not just a road, but an entire architecture of social division to reach someone his world had trained him to walk past. The audience listening to Jesus that day did not need the mechanics of economics explained to them. They lived inside those mechanics. They knew what it meant to watch a traveler's options narrow one by one in a courtyard. They knew the face of the man who had run out of money and run out of moves. They knew the particular stillness of a person who has arrived at Aperos, that suspended, airless place where no road forward is visible, and they understood, with a clarity we can only recover by rebuilding the world around the text, that what the Samaritan did was not merely kind. It was a recreation of the conditions of dignity for a man from whom those conditions had been entirely stripped. He did not offer sympathy from a distance. He made himself financially, physically, and reputationally responsible for a stranger's survival. In a world where honor and obligation were always tethered to known relationships, family, village, tribe, religion, he extended the logic of kinship to a man who shared none of his markers. This is what Jesus held up as the answer to who is my neighbor, not a feeling, an action with economic cost, physical inconvenience, and social risk attached to it. The inn, in the time of Jesus, was a place where the thinness of human survival became visible, where the distance between stability and collapse was measured in the smallest bronze coins in circulation, where a single illness, a single robbery, a single wrong turn on a mountain road could reduce a person to invisibility. The world Jesus moved through was not a world of abstraction. It was a world of dirt roads and animal smells, and the particular desperation of a man watching his last coin leave his hand at a courtyard counter with no certainty of what came after. Jesus knew that world from the inside. He walked its roads. He slept in its common rooms. He spoke to people whose daily survival hung on conditions most modern readers have never had to consider. And when he told a story about a man left for dead on the road to Jericho, he was not reaching for a metaphor. He was pointing at something his audience had already seen and asking them what they had done about it. The faith that emerges from understanding this is not softer than the faith built on abstraction. It is harder, more demanding, more human. It asks not what you believe about your neighbor, but what you are willing to spend.